The sun over the small kingdom of Viridia had always been a warm, golden friend, but on the day the Athelian envoy arrived, it felt cold, casting long, menacing shadows across the sapphire-domed capital. Queen Alara, barely 25, stood at the heart of her throne room. Her crown, a simple circlet of white gold set with one flawless aquamarine, felt suddenly heavy, like a vice clamping down on her hope. Viridia was a jewel, lush, mineral-rich, and strategically positioned on the only stable land bridge between the continental powers. But jewels, Alara knew, always attracted the greediest hands. Today, the Empire's hand had arrived, gloved in obsidian steel. The envoy, a man named General Varric, did not kneel. He didn't even bow. He simply stood, a towering figure draped in the soot-black uniform of Athelia, his face a mask of cold, dismissive boredom. Around him, the air in the Viridian court thickened with the silent, suffocating fear of the counselors, men and women who had watched the Athelian Empire absorb every neighbor, big or small, for a generation. They had seen the maps shrink, their world reduced to a final, desperate pinprick of sovereignty. Varric cleared his throat, the sound sharp and disrespectful in the hushed hall. Queen Alara of Viridia. His voice boomed, amplified by a concealed device, making every word a declaration of inevitability. The Emperor Rexus sends his greetings and his terms. Your kingdom's mineral reserves, specifically the deep-vein quartz and the crystalline waterways, are deemed critical to imperial stability. You will surrender 50% of all extracted materials immediately. You will also allow the permanent establishment of 3 imperial garrisons on your northern border. Do this, and Viridia maintains its local governance, provided it always acts in concert with imperial interests. Refuse, and the imperial legions will relieve you of all governance by the next new moon. He didn't look at her eyes. He looked past her, as if addressing a wall ornament. The word struck the room like a physical blow. A collective gasp rippled through the gathered nobles. 50% was a death sentence, a slow, suffocating tax that would turn Viridia into a starved, puppet state. 3 garrisons meant Athelian rule in all but name. Lord Theron, Alara's elderly chief strategist, stumbled forward, his hands trembling. Your Grace, this is annexation. We are a free people. We will fight. Alara raised a hand, silencing Theron's outburst. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, but it possessed a clear, melodic strength that cut through the fear-laced tension. It was the voice of a scholar, a diplomat, and a queen who had prepared for this moment since she was a child. General Varric, she said, stepping down from the dais. She walked slowly, deliberately, her soft slippers making no sound on the polished sapphire floor, until she stood mere feet from the towering general. She had to look up to meet his eyes, but her gaze did not waver. I understand the nature of your terms. They are, as your emperor intended, non-negotiable demands dressed as an offer. Varric permitted himself a faint, cruel smile. The queen understands politics. I appreciate the clarity. Clarity is essential, Alara agreed, her eyes glittering with a fierce intelligence Varric failed to register. You come here believing you hold all the power. You believe that because your swords are sharper and your armies larger, my only choice is surrender or ruin. You mistake size for strength, General. You mistake brute force for true power. She paused, allowing her words to sink into the heavy silence. You said you require the deep-vein quartz and the crystalline waterways for imperial stability. That is only partially true. You require resources. But what if I offered the Emperor something far more valuable than half a mine? Something that could guarantee him total, undisputed dominance, not just of the continent, but of the very laws of trade and warfare. Varric's mask of boredom finally cracked. His eyebrows lowered in suspicious surprise. The counselors behind Alara shifted uneasily, their earlier despair replaced by utter confusion. What was she doing? They all knew Viridia possessed no superweapon, no secret army, no hidden gold hoard that could sway the Emperor. Alara leaned in slightly, lowering her voice so that only Varric and the innermost circle of her guards could hear the next crucial words. The Emperor Rexus seeks stability through resources, but he covets innovation above all else. General, Viridia holds the key to the Echo Silk. Varric frowned, a deep line appearing between his eyes. The name meant nothing to him, which was exactly what Alara had intended. It was a new name, a name invented 5 days ago in the deepest archives of her library. But the way she said it, with absolute conviction and a hint of intoxicating secrecy, was enough to make the general hesitate. Athelia's greatest fear was complacency, the idea that a smaller, nimble power might develop an advantage they hadn't yet crushed. Echo Silk, Varric repeated, tasting the foreign words. You have 60 seconds to explain why I should not dismiss that as a final, desperate lie. The deep vein quartz, Alara continued quickly, pressing her advantage, is valuable because it is an energy conduit. The Echo Silk is not a conduit. It is a reflector. It doesn't move power. It bounces, mirrors, and doubles any energy signature, making your communication systems undetectable and your targeting systems infallible. General, if the Emperor wishes to control the world, he needs to control information. My raw quartz gives him energy. My Echo Silk gives him omnipotence. And I have enough of it hidden to coat every single one of your ships. It was a blatant, calculated exaggeration, a magnificent, terrifying bluff. The Echo Silk did exist, a tiny, almost useless fiber spun by a forgotten sect of Iridian weavers, known only for its unique optical qualities. But Varric didn't know that. He only knew that the Queen, who should be weeping and pleading, was offering the Empire absolute power with a calm, unwavering confidence. He hesitated. To ignore this, to crush Viridia outright, would be to risk missing the very key to total victory. His orders were to secure resources, but the allure of a unique, world-altering technology was a powerful lure. The general had a reputation for ruthlessness, but he also had a reputation for never missing an opportunity to enrich the Empire's might. This is a matter for the Emperor, not for me, Varric said, his voice now lower, tinged with grudging respect. You will accompany me back to the Imperial City. Immediately. We will negotiate the Echo Silk, and you will pay for my trouble by bringing 100% of your deep vein quartz with you as a sign of good faith. But know this, Queen Alara. If this Echo Silk is a lie, if you waste the Emperor's time, your ruin will be agonizing and absolute. You will trade your life for the word of a weaver. Alara finally let a ghost of a true smile touch her lips. If the Echo Silk is a lie, General, then I am merely a foolish girl who made a bad bargain. If it is real, she finished, her voice stealing, then Viridia will trade its resources, but never its freedom. I accept your escort. Let us go to the heart of the Empire and make a deal. She had bought herself time, but she was stepping directly into the lion's den. This was not a victory. It was merely the first, terrifying move in a high-stakes game of chess, and she was already cornered. 2 years later, the obsidian cage felt heavier than ever, but now the weight was internal, crushing the morale of the Athelian Empire from within. The public narrative that the withdrawal from Viridia was due to a logistical anomaly was slowly crumbling under the weight of persistent, frustrating reality. Emperor Rexus sat alone in his refurbished observatory, no longer surrounded by screens displaying real-time data, but by stacks of outdated paper reports, a sign of his growing paranoia regarding all digital networks. The core of the problem remained unsolved: the Ethernet. Rexus had poured immense resources into rebuilding the network with redundant systems, but Dr. Solis, haunted by his failure and convinced that Alara's primitive math concealed an advanced alien intelligence, had become erratic. Solis still hunted the phantom logic bomb, and every time he integrated a new security fix, he introduced new, unpredictable bugs that destabilized the network further. Rexus could no longer trust the speed of his own commands. He could not risk a major foreign campaign, knowing that the simple act of ordering a large-scale mobilization might cause his supply matrix to crash or his legions to receive contradictory retreat orders. The Empire was huge, yet paralyzed by its own structural fear. Rexus needed a target for his fury, a person to punish, but Alara was untouchable, protected by a legally binding, publicly recorded treaty that the Emperor himself had signed. To break the treaty would be to openly admit defeat and reveal the true nature of the paralysis, which would invite every minor kingdom to revolt. Instead, Rexus turned his fury inward, purging General Varric and anyone associated with the initial, humiliating failure, but this merely increased the institutional chaos. Meanwhile, Queen Alara's kingdom thrived. The establishment of the Royal Viridian Archive and Cartography Office had quietly positioned Viridia as the continental hub for intelligence analysis. Alara didn't gather information for invasion, she gathered it for leverage. She cataloged the resource needs, debt cycles, and internal political schisms of every kingdom. When a minor dispute arose between two nearby powers, Viridia often stepped in to mediate, not with military force, but with accurate, proprietary information that settled the conflict before it escalated. Viridia became essential to regional stability, a diplomatic fulcrum in a region always prone to war. The 5 trade partners Alara had secured access to the Waterways Charter were now deeply dependent on Viridia's reliable resource flows. They didn't just buy quartz, they bought stability. When Rexus, out of spite, threatened to impose harsh tariffs on one of those nations, 5 separate delegations immediately lodged formal complaints with Ethel, backed by subtle but firm diplomatic pressure. Viridia had forged an economic shield. One evening, Alara received a package. It was a single, meticulously labeled scientific report, smuggled out of Ethel by a former colleague of Dr. Solis, who was fleeing the Empire's oppressive paranoia. The report was Dr. Solis's complete, detailed analysis of the echo-silk harmonic resonance principles, the final, corrected solution. The doctor had been driven mad, but in his madness, he had finally cracked the fake math, proudly concluding that the true nature of the echo-silk was that it was non-existent, an elaborate psychological ruse that exploited Athelian arrogance. Alara read the report carefully. The truth, in the hands of the paranoid Rexus, would have been a catalyst for renewed, unbridled fury and invasion. But Rexus would never see this report. The only man who could confirm this devastating truth was Dr. Solis, and Solis was now locked away in an imperial asylum, babbling about crystalline conspiracies. The Empire remained convinced that a powerful, undetectable weapon was waiting to be deployed if they made a wrong move. Alara ordered the report burned, ensuring the secret of her bluff died with the paper. She smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. The most brilliant move of the Quiet War was not a destructive act, but the maintenance of a permanent fear. Athelia was too powerful to be crushed, but it could be frozen in place. And as long as Rexus was paralyzed by the terror of the logic bomb, Viridia would remain free, protected not by walls of stone, but by the impenetrable logic of a queen who understood that the foundation of any empire, no matter how strong, is ultimately built on the fragile commodity of trust. The true checkmate was not the withdrawal of the legions, but the slow, agonizing, internal decay of the emperor's confidence. 5 years had passed since the Great Withdrawal. Viridia was no longer the jewel coveted by empires, but the keystone of regional trade. Queen Alara, now 30, had successfully managed the slow decay of Athelian power, using her royal archives intelligence to mediate conflicts and consolidate Viridia's status as a necessary neutral party. The peace was real, yet fragile, built on the shifting sand of Emperor Rexus's enduring paranoia. Rexus, confined to his black towers, had failed in every attempt to restore the Ethernet's speed. He was aging prematurely, the years of self-doubt etched into his features. But the one thing he had not lost was his intellect, honed now not by ambition, but by a singular, burning desire for revenge against the woman who had defeated his perfect logic. He could not wage war, but he could wage economics. Alara's primary defense, the economic shield, relied on the stable value of deep-vein quartz, which Viridia sold at fair market rates to fund its stability projects and leverage its diplomatic position. Rexus planned to shatter this foundation entirely. He began the final gambit subtly. Over 6 months, Rexus authorized the secret, massive purchase of continental quartz futures, locking up vast swathes of the global supply using shell corporations. Then, in a single, brutal morning, Ethel dumped nearly a decade's worth of its own immense, reserved quartz stockpiles onto the global commodity market at below production cost. The move was designed to be instantly catastrophic. The result was immediate. The global price of deep-vein quartz plummeted, crashing the markets and instantly devaluing Viridia's core export. The 5 waterways charter partners, suddenly holding worthless contracts, turned on Alara, threatening to break their treaties. Rexus's message was clear. I may not be able to crush your walls, but I will starve your economy until your people turn on you. Lord Theron, now the efficient head of the archive, burst into Alara's study, clutching frantic reports. My queen, it's a total economic war. Our revenue has halved overnight. We cannot sustain the charter. The price of quartz is below water shipping costs. We have 3 days before the treasury is empty and the partners break ranks. Alara, studying a financial graph projected onto her desk, remained calm. She had anticipated Rexus's final, desperate move would be non-military. Her royal archive hadn't just studied logistics, it had built an intricate map of Ethel's internal financial architecture. Rexus had sought maximum speed and efficiency in his rebuild, creating a highly centralized system, the very flaw Alara had exploited years ago. The Emperor's move is clever, Alara admitted, tracing a line on the graph. He is using his reserves to buy our silence. But Theron, where does Rexus' ration 7 come from now? It's produced in 16 highly complex, localized plants as part of his redundancy plan, Theron replied. They require constant, massive, secured infusions of funds to maintain the new, complex supply contracts. It's an inefficient beast, but it's safe. And where do those funds come from? The Imperial Treasury, backed by the stability of the Imperial credit. Exactly, Alara said, her eyes gleaming. Rexus's new redundancy costs a fortune to maintain. He cannot afford any disruption to his cash flow. He crashed the quartz market, but in doing so, he made himself vulnerable to a deeper panic. Alara issued a single order to the archive. She did not command them to sell quartz or stabilize the market. She commanded them to release 5 years of meticulously compiled, proprietary data to Viridia's trade partners. This data detailed the terrifying actual, non-public debt ratios of the vast network of contracts Rexus had set up to fund his redundant supply systems, along with projections showing how any sustained instability in Ethel's own core industrial exports, not quartz, but the raw materials for the new Ethernet, would trigger a collapse in Imperial credit value. It was a perfectly timed strike aimed at the Empire's new vulnerability, financial fragility. Within 24 hours, the panic shifted continents. The 5 Viridian partners, rather than breaking their charter, panicked over the stability of their own Imperial credit holdings. They realized that Rexus's desperate attempt to destroy Viridia's quartz market was a symptom of the Empire's own precarious financial state. Global investors, witnessing the data released by the trusted Viridian archive, began selling Imperial credit in a terrifying cascade. Emperor Rexus watched in horror as the price of his empire's very currency began to freefall. The economic collapse threatened to shut down the 16 localized Rexus ration 7 plants simultaneously, a disaster far worse than the original KRYLL weakness. Alara waited only until the Imperial credit had dropped 20% before sending a single, coded message via a neutral embassy, addressed personally to the Emperor. It contained 3 words: restore the price. Rexus, trapped between the slow-motion collapse of his currency and the possibility of his legions starving in a week, capitulated instantly. He commanded his remaining treasury to re-enter the quartz market, aggressively buying up the stockpiles he had just dumped, forcing the price back up and stabilizing the entire global commodity. The cost was astronomical, but the alternative was annihilation. Alara's final victory was complete. She had not only survived the economic attack, but she had used the threat of trust instability to force the Emperor to underwrite the global quartz market, guaranteeing Viridia's economic prosperity forever. As Rexus sat alone in his observatory, staring at the graphs that confirmed his humiliating defeat, he finally understood. Alara didn't need a superweapon. She had mastered the deepest lesson of power. While an emperor tries to control the rules of the game, the market, the laws of physics, a true strategist controls the perceptions and trust upon which those rules are based. The obsidian cage was now fully the emperor's, a monument not to his power, but to his own rigid, paralyzing fear of the woman who had understood his foundation better than he did. Viridia, forever free, thrived under the light of a queen whose ultimate strength was not force, but wisdom. 20 years later, the world had fundamentally changed. The empire of Ethel still existed, but it was no longer the black, sharp claw reaching across the continent. It had become a rigid, bureaucratic monument to its own complexity. Emperor Rexus, now an old man, rarely left his observatory, dedicating the last 2 decades of his life to designing an Ethernet so redundant, so complex, that it took 10 times the manpower and resources to operate, ensuring its speed was glacial but, crucially, absolutely impervious to any logic loop or echo-silk sabotage. He had achieved absolute security, but at the cost of all efficiency and ambition. The obsidian cage, now fully transparent and entirely secure, had become his comfortable, self-imposed prison. Athelia was stuck in a state of permanent stasis. Viridia, by contrast, thrived. Queen Alara, now in her 50s, was known universally as Alara the Architect. Her kingdom had leveraged the enforced stability of the quartz market to become the undisputed nexus of trust for the continent. The Royal Viridian Archive and Cartography Office had transformed into the Continental Economic Registry, CER. Nations no longer relied on imperial credit or the unstable banks of rival kingdoms. They pegged their stability and conducted their sensitive transactions through the Viridian CER, trusting its data accuracy and Alara's guarantee of neutrality. The core principle of Viridia's global influence was simple: information without ambition. Alara never gathered intelligence to conquer, she gathered it to maintain balance. When 2 powers prepared for war, the CER would quietly leak precise, nonpartisan data to both sides, detailing the exact logistical cost, the predictable collapse of mutual trade, and the guaranteed outcome of a bloody stalemate. This objective, devastatingly accurate analysis, untainted by political motive, proved more effective than any standing army. Viridia had perfected the art of making war economically and politically unthinkable. Lord Theron, now a wizened but spry old statesman, oversaw the CER. He still kept a small, private archive where he stored all the original, faked documents and equations of the Echo Silk, the ultimate physical record of the bluff. He often looked at the file on Dr. Solis, who had passed away years earlier, still convinced he was chasing an interdimensional crystalline entity. Theron had ensured the lie had maintained its power until it no longer mattered. Alara's final great action was the codification of her philosophy into the Charter of Systemic Stability, an agreement signed by every major continental power. It was the world's first true peace treaty, one that did not rely on military guarantees, but on mutual economic dependence and a universally trusted, neutral source of truth, Viridia. The legacy of the Echo Silk was no longer a threat of silence, but the very sound of Viridia's ongoing prosperity. The small kingdom, once doomed to absorption, had proven that ultimate power did not reside in possessing the biggest stick, but in understanding the delicate architecture of the system itself. Alara retired not to a battlefield memorial, but to a quiet tower overlooking the crystalline waterways, dedicating her later years to studying celestial mechanics. She knew that even the universe was a system of rules, and to understand the rules was to master the game. Viridia, the little kingdom that outwitted an empire, stood forever as a shining monument to the power of pure intellect, patience, and controlled information. 30 years had passed since the Athelian threat dissolved into bureaucratic self-paralysis. Queen Alara the Architect, now nearing 70, spent her days in the quiet tower, studying the slow, predictable majesty of the stars. She rarely intervened in the affairs of state, for the state ran itself, perfectly balanced on the principles she had codified. The daily work of maintaining the peace fell to her granddaughter and heir, Queen Lyra, a woman of 28 who had never seen an imperial warship in anger, yet governed the vast engine of the Continental Economic Registry, CER. Viridia was the anchor of the world, but anchors are often resented by those who wish to sail faster. In a hidden, neutral city, a new threat had quietly formed: the League of the Ascendant. This was a coalition of three ambitious, mid-sized kingdoms, Jara, Calais, and the Maritime Republic of Terran, who chafed under the stability imposed by the Charter of Systemic Stability. They saw Viridia's neutrality and reliance on accurate data as an obstacle to their own territorial expansion and wealth accumulation. They believed that Alera's peace was merely a sophisticated form of control, preventing any new empire from rising. The League didn't plan a war of steel. They planned a war of disruption. Their strategy was to simultaneously withdraw from the Charter of Systemic Stability and flood the CER with deliberately falsified data, phantom resource requests, manipulated debt figures, and non-existent trade routes, designed to overload the registry and erode the universal trust upon which Viridia's power rested. If the CER could be proven fallible, the global economy would crash, and the resulting chaos would allow the League to seize territory and resources unimpeded. Queen Lyra faced the crisis not with the cold resolve of her grandmother, but with a quiet, profound sense of dread. The problem was insidious. "Grandmother," Lyra confessed, meeting Alera in her observation tower, "they are trying to break the system itself. If we try to isolate the falsified data, the League will claim we are censoring them, and the resulting public doubt will spread faster than any truth. We cannot use force. We cannot even use open censure without confirming their conspiracy theories. The CER will become a source of chaos, not trust." Alera, who had been observing the distant, slow rotation of a newly charted planet, did not look away from her telescope. "The League of the Ascendant, Lyra," she said, her voice clear despite her age, "is defined by its ambition. Ambition is not a plan. It is a hunger. When systems are complex, hunger always leads to contradiction. The beauty of the Charter is not that it stops war, but that it makes contradiction impossible to hide. Go to the archive. Do not look for their lies. Look for their truth." Lyra returned to the vast, humming headquarters of the CER, now led by the aging, wise Lord Theron. She realized the key was not reacting to the League's moves, but analyzing their inherent weaknesses, which the Charter's data compelled them to record. The League was built on a lie: that Jara's steel, Calais's grain, and Terran's ships could all be combined to crush the stability of the Charter. Lyra ordered the CER's advanced analytical engines to cross-reference every data point from the three League nations over the past 5 years. She wasn't looking for discrepancies in the current filings. She was looking for systemic debt patterns that predated the conspiracy. Within a day, the analysis was complete, and Lyra saw the truth that Alera had predicted. Jara, the Steel Kingdom, was deeply reliant on Calais's grain to feed its massive, non-agricultural workforce. Calais, in turn, was dependent on Terran's ships to export 90% of that grain and avoid massive internal stockpiling. And Terran, the Maritime Republic, was nearly bankrupt due to the immense, unserviceable debt it carried from building ships too large for its own limited coastal trade, ships it had planned to sell to the newly conquering Jara. The League was not a coalition of strength. It was an alliance of three desperate, mutually dependent countries, each seeking chaos to erase their own crippling, internal financial failures. Their collective weakness was greater than Viridia's strength. Lyra didn't release the crippling analysis as a whole. She released it in a series of 3, seemingly innocuous, highly specific reports to each member of the League, disguised as standard CER advisories. To Jara, Steel, a report detailing the precise 3-month supply window. Calais would have to close all export routes to meet its own internal consumption during an economic collapse, exposing Jara's imminent food shortage. To Calais, Grain, a detailed projection showing that the only ships large enough to carry their current grain surplus were Terran's new fleet, which Terran was secretly planning to sell off to a hostile third party to cover their debts, leaving Calais with no export capacity whatsoever. To Terran, ships a public but buried addendum to a standard global maritime stability report, noting the rising internal political risk in Jara, suggesting that Jara's ability to purchase Terran's massive ships was now questionable. Within 48 hours, the League of the Ascendant imploded. Jara, terrified of famine, pulled back from the conspiracy, prioritizing a private, frantic negotiation with Kales for guaranteed grain contracts. Kales, realizing their only export route was about to be sold off by their supposed ally Terran, publicly denounced the League. Terran, facing the possibility of massive, worthless ships, dissolved the pact to secure emergency refinancing through the only stable mechanism left, the Viridian CR. The entire threat vanished, not through battle or even direct accusation, but because Queen Lyra, guided by her grandmother's philosophy, had simply shown each member the unavoidable truth of their own financial peril, a truth made transparent by the very system they sought to break. Lyra returned to the tower, the morning sun streaming through the glass. Alara turned from her telescope, a rare, warm smile on her face. "You did not fight them, Lyra. You showed them themselves. They tried to break the system with lies," Lyra said, the fatigue of the past 3 days heavy in her voice. "But the system forced them to reveal their own foundational truth." "Precisely," Alara affirmed. The victory over Ethel was about controlling perception and creating fear. The victory today, Lyra, was about proving that truth is the only sustainable commodity. As long as Viridia provides the most accurate reflection of reality, no amount of ambition or steel can permanently challenge the peace. That is the true, lasting legacy of the architect. A decade after the implosion of the League of the Ascendant, the stability Alara the architect had engineered was absolute. Queen Lyra, now 38, oversaw a world where conflict was financially predictable and thus politically obsolete. Viridia's Continental Economic Registry, CER, was the unchallenged oracle of global truth, its data universally trusted because it had never failed to accurately map the consequences of chaos. But true peace, Lyra was learning, often breeds new forms of fanaticism.